And there's also more recently been a history of testing, and of course, controversy, which follows the revealing of any results. In 2010, the EPA did respond to complaints by some Wyoming residents and did some testing around Pavillion. Deb, you were actually a member of the group that went to Denver to talk to the EPA. What were you asking for?
The specific request that we made for Pavillion was that all of the water wells that we knew were impacted because people could see the changes in their water, smell it, taste it. We asked that all of those wells be tested using the same test methods. There had been some tests done, but they hadn't been the same test methods, and so it was really hard to tell if the contamination in each well was on its own contamination or if it was related. And also we asked that groundwater flow testing be done so that we could establish whether there was a plume that could be moving into other wells.
Well, that's a lot of technical sort of aspects, but there was also an aspect of you just looking for some attention, weren't you? I mean, you have not...
We were asking the federal government to take action when we didn't feel the state had.
I would not disagree with some of what Deb said, but we've been involved in the Pavillion area, for example, since 2004. 2005, when Jeff Locker and Louis Meeks first came to the agency. It's important to note that the Department of Environmental Quality does not regulate private water wells. And it's also important to note that...
Can you test them?
No, unless the landowner allows us to test them and if we have the resources to do it. So we were asked to look into that. We went to the operator, and the operator paid for quite a number of tests in those wells. And we were seeing some minor hits of some hydrocarbons that we weren't sure where they came from. We continued to not see any violations of water quality standards. And right towards the end, before EPA was requested to come in, we were beginning to change the focus of our thinking towards more bacterial types of causes. But it is safe to say that both the residents up there were impatient and not happy with the slowness at which we were going at this, went to EPA, and quite frankly, we welcomed the EPA coming in. EPA has a huge number of technical resources at their disposal. They have a lot of money, and since then, I think the news stories would tell you this: that millions of dollars have been spent.
I'd like to reiterate what John said. It's important to know that oversight of oil and gas drilling and water wells is divided among many different agencies. And heck, oil and gas wells, depending on what, some are federal, some are state, some are on private minerals. So there's always a lot of different agencies involved, and each agency has its mission and its focus. We are lucky in Wyoming that we're small enough that our agencies can talk to one another and work with one another on these. But yeah, the residents of the Pavillion area that I talked to said that they'd been asking questions and they hadn't been getting answers for years, many years.
It also comes down to understanding how the different agencies fit together, as Dustin said, and where people need to go for answers. And while we do a great job and have improved the coordination between federal agencies and the state agencies over the years, we are still working on that.
Well, but not to get too caught up in how government departments interact with each other. The fact is, as you saw in the video, that you've got somebody like Jeff Locker with a black filter every 3 days because he has really bad water. He's not alone in this, and it does lead to the question of what does an average citizen do who doesn't have attorneys, doesn't have lobbyists like the big companies do? Where do they turn if the state agency spends years not really getting them satisfaction?
Well, I think the question, if I can make it just slightly broader, first of all, residents come to us all the time, and we respond all the time. There are areas in which we can respond within our authorities and jurisdictions and do something about it, and there are limits to our authorities and jurisdictions. That's where Bob comes in, or the state engineer, or the BLM, or some other federal agency. The way in which we approach our business is that when we see a problem, we try to understand that problem. But before we can take corrective action, we need to get clear on the source of the problem, and we need to get clear on the pathway, for example, and then we need to get clear on the responsible party. And quite frankly, Richard, we're at this now for the better part of 7 or 8 years, and while we've got a lot of data and a lot of information, we still have a lot of work yet to do before we answer those basic questions. So sometimes it takes a long time, but then you can go into cleanup and mitigation. And I want to point out, if I can, right now, that the governor has done a couple of things that are important to note. The first is the governor and the legislature have provided a fresh source of drinking water for those residents in Pavillion. And that is going to continue until we find science-based answers to what's going on up there.
I believe the residents have to pay for their own storage tanks, though, do they not?
No, the cisterns themselves that are going to be installed are going to be paid for by the state, including the plumbing to the home. Long term, the residents will have to pay for their own water at this point in time.
Water and upkeep. And, you know, I have to say that drinking water is not the only issue. Because there's, you know, when you're dealing with the kind of contamination that occurs when you're in the middle of a gas field, there's many different exposure pathways. And so it's not just about drinking water, it's about taking a shower, it's about what you're breathing, it's about the exposures that you've had that you can't talk about because you don't know what was in those exposures. It's far more complex than just getting drinking water, although it's really important that they have clean drinking water. Absolutely.
And I think there's a lot of, there doesn't seem to be conclusive science on either side here, but a lot of anecdotal evidence, as we see with particular instances of wells going bad. Our producer Stephanie Smith actually contacted a couple of well drillers in the Pavillion area to tap their experience. They had worked for more than 30 years in the area, and they had never heard of any good wells going bad. Because I know that it's in a gas field that these people are, but
I would like to interject and say that not all of the evidence is anecdotal. We do have real evidence. We have a real scientific investigation in the works with EPA. That's real data, and now we have the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey. That's real data. So I mean, it's not all anecdotal.
And Richard, if I might add to that, that data shows that the only exceedances to drinking water quality standards are from natural elements. The 2 deep monitor wells that EPA drilled showed an exceedance in one of those wells of benzene, which is an exceedance of a significant exceedance of a water quality standard. But in the near-surface water wells, which is where we all got started on this problem in the first place, we're still trying to get to the answers. There are some compounds that were detected. We understand that. And we have got a task force working on trying to understand the potential sources, which would be the drill holes, and which would be the old mud pits, reserve pits that were associated with those holes. But it's important to note that the water out there, where we do see exceedances of water quality standards, it's from natural causes.
You had something you want to say?
Yeah, I think it should be mentioned that as this Pavillion case was developing, the rest of the nation got introduced to hydraulic fracturing about the same time. Areas of the United States that were not as familiar with the oil and gas industry as we are in Wyoming. So there was a lot of concern outside of Wyoming in the eastern U.S., in Pennsylvania, New York, about hydraulic fracturing because they were just hearing about
Yeah,
it.
the New York governor has just called for a new round of public hearings because of the public pressure.
And so the oil and gas industry made a really strong stance. It drew a line in the sand and said there has never been one case of fracking contaminating drinking water. And frankly, they did a really poor job of relating this to the public because they drew the line in the sand. So now that they raised the stakes, now that there's an investigation going on in Wyoming, then there was a perception that, by God, they're not going to let this be that one case. So there's a matter of trust going on.
Well, Bob, I mean, isn't that, when you just look at it from a sort of common sense point of view, even if the instances of, there was a home that exploded in Ohio, wells blowing up, they're rare, but they're real. And what are people to conclude when they hear the industry say there has never been a case? That sort of absolute.
Well, industry isn't, as I view it, drawing a line in the sand. I think they're stating a fact because there indeed has not been a documented, proven case of hydraulic fracturing that has contaminated groundwater. Now, there are allegations, there may be evidence depending on the strength of that evidence, but there's still investigation going on. Now, I think what industry perhaps has learned most from this whole experience is that if you go into an area, either on an exploration mindset or a development mindset to develop hydrocarbons, that the most effective way to evaluate what's going on is to get a base analysis of all of the groundwater and the surface waters that are out there before any drilling is done. That was not done at Pavillion and generally has not been done industry-wide, but I think from the indications that I've received, both as a supervisor of the commission and also prior to that as a consultant, is an industry realizes that you need to have baseline data of your water and of your soils before you go in, so that you have a little more concrete
That's exactly
comparison.
We're just about out of time, Deb.
Well, I just want to add that when the citizens in Pavillion went to EPA, it wasn't about hydraulic fracturing. It was about contamination in their water. And
They hadn't yet drawn the line, I take it.
if we were having a discussion about whether drilling practices had contaminated groundwater and drinking water wells, there wouldn't be a discussion because it's very well documented that there's been severe contamination
And
from
I'm
drilling.
Thanks. I want to pick up on something that Deb said, which is very true. There has been something that has gone wrong with some of those water wells for those people in Pavillion, as an example. There are other places in the state where we have had some problems. When we look
the Pinedale area earlier.
Sure, and Clark, Wyoming is another example where there was an incident. So and the important thing to note is that we do not in any way, shape, or form doubt those residents that something has gone wrong with their water. But when we go out and test it, we also need to understand where did that contamination come from. And that's the unanswered question. And I wanted to point out that the governor has directed all of us, Bob King and myself, to continue to work on this until we find the answers.
Well, isn't it
So
true,
we
though,
wanna make
that
sure
there's,
that the
there's a lot of
message that's out
ingredients
there-
that's hard to test for because you don't know what they are? I mean, in the fracking fluid itself.
And in the drilling fluids.
Sure. And that's why I think EPA's suite of compounds that they tested is just very lengthy, very lengthy. But,
It definitely
got it
is
pretty good.
lengthy, but to determine where the contamination is coming from, I think you have to know what the contamination is. The unfortunate part about this is for the people on the ground. And, this has now become all about fracking, which it isn't all about. It's about living with oil and gas exploration, drilling, development, and production. And there are a lot of problems. And, if we could all get past the game of blaming fracking or industry not wanting to take responsibility for what could be their problem or their liabilities, then maybe the people who are actually on the ground suffering the consequences of what has gone wrong would not be in the position they're in.
Yeah, I mean, because typically Wyoming people don't like to complain.
These are not a bunch
there's
of
a
radicals.
long history of coexistence with the oil and gas industry here, and it's really more in recent years that we've heard of cases like this.
Hey, when your whole world is turned upside down, you are scared to drink your water, you have to get up 3 or 4 times a night to see if something's blowing up or running over or, emitting something into the atmosphere that could affect you. You see your family getting sick, you have all kinds of strange diseases that you can't be explained no matter what doctors you go to. It's a very desperate situation.
Well, and what about the water consumption too? I mean, in terms of the environmental issues that are connected to this, I've read that the average well takes about 5 million gallons over its lifespan, and that's, if you're trucking it out as wastewater, that's about 1,000 truck trips. In Canada has about 140 wells just in the area of Pavillion, so that would be 140,000 truck trips. Yeah. I'm sure they don't do that number, but how do you mitigate that? In other words, how do you?
This takes a lot of planning on the front end. First of all, just to know what resources that are in the mix. Everywhere you drill, there are water resources, and Wyoming doesn't have a really good inventory of its groundwater or what's in there. And usually, industry responds to markets and shareholders. So when they're ready to drill, they're ready to drill. But it really does take a lot of front work to plan on, okay, where is industry going to draw its water from? How is industry going to treat its used water and dispose of it? Are our roads built for these big convoys of Halliburton tanker trucks? Most of them in southeast Wyoming are built for farm equipment and pickup trucks.
Where does the
it takes a lot of planning.
In Pavillion, it's disposed of into disposal wells that are off the structure or away from the productive part of the field.
Now, so more wells, but still in the Pavillion area?
Yes.
And I'm just wondering what kind of volume we're really talking. I mean, are they able to recycle any of that water to reuse it or to recapture it?
From what I know of that area, that water is not of the standard that an operator would like to have to, say, drill another well with or to even frack with. It does come out with some formation contaminants that makes it unsuitable to use for drilling or stimulation.
Well, and there's one other thing that I think we should really talk about or think about as a state, and that is industry is doing their job because their job is to produce the product and make money. But what we need is a state government who will have good oversight over that industry, because that's what is going to protect the other resources and the public. So I don't think it should just be in terms of what industry wants or what's the most economically viable for industry. It should be about what is the best for our state as a whole, and for all our resources, including our people.
Well, no, I agree with that wholeheartedly, Deb, and I would have to say, though, that it's my experience and my opinion that the Wyoming Oil and Gas Commission, whose rules cover all the wells in the state. Now, we do have a memorandum of understanding with the Bureau of Land Management with respect to the federal lands, but I think the history of the Oil and Gas Commission, and I realize that there are some views that feel otherwise, but my view is that the Oil and Gas Commission has been very effective in regulating the industry and setting rules and regulations that protect the human health and the environment, protect relative rights, prevent waste of the resource, which is its charge. I think overall it's thought of very highly.
I think it takes more than just managing and overseeing the industry. That's the way we were set up. What we don't have is a way to help landowners. We don't have an agency that does that. We don't have an agency that can help investigate and thoroughly step in and help a community get its questions answered or protect them from pollution in the first place. I think
So
think
far, it's been not my department.
well, a lot of our agencies were established 30 years ago and 40 years ago, and maybe haven't caught up with the technology or the nature of development these days. I just don't think the way we manage and oversee the industry is enough. There has to be some group of experts that can pull all the resources together to help out a community.
And also to really look at what the impacts are going to be to the other resources. That's not considered, or we wouldn't have the contamination issues that we have, and there's a bunch of them. We wouldn't have places like Pavillion, like Clark, like Deaver, and like the Jonah Field, where the other resources that we all depend on are at risk.
Well, again, I think some of those instances that you referred to can be identified with the specific failure of an equipment or failure of a process or something specifically with your Clark.
It can, but I can tell you that I live in Clark, and I was there from the get-go before this round of development started there, and we made complaint after complaint after complaint after complaint to all the agencies asking that somebody come and look at what was happening and do something about it. And I want to say there are a lot of good people who are working within the agencies. I can't paint everybody with the same pen and say everybody's bad, because there's not. There's a lot of good people.
So you tried state agencies first before you ended up visiting
Absolutely.
Denver with the EPA?
For 5 years.
Well, and I guess I would...
6 years before we went to EPA.
I would say, too, that I think agencies are concerned with the public's issues. I agree that perhaps there's a perception, or there are times when it's not my responsibility. You need
or
to call
mission, really, because each agency has a mission.
But we get calls frequently at the Oil and Gas Commission, as John referred to, from landowners, and we try to address them as best we can. Whether or not we have a specific rule or regulation that says, yeah, this is our charge or this isn't our charge, we're concerned about it. We don't.
But still, we see these personal cases that have been profiled in the media, but they're real, of people just sort of hung up for years because there's nobody that can really step in and help them.
Well, no, and also before the major incidents happen, people who are living on the ground recognize changes in their environment and in their land that other people don't see. And so when they're lodging those complaints and saying there's a train that's going off the tracks, there needs to be better communication between the agencies and the people who are on the ground.
You know, and I started to say this earlier, but the Governor Friedenthal created an executive order that Governor Meade then endorsed and recreated in his term early. And it creates a Groundwater Protection Council in the state. Now, each one of our agencies has a set of jurisdictions and authorities, and we each have things in our statutes that prevent us from getting into the other person's regulatory world. And so we look at the way in which all these regulatory agencies have their different missions, and we think about the problems you raised, the problems Deb raised. Now, the other thing that has gone on in Wyoming is that, as you noted earlier, there has been a significant increase in intense energy development in the state, without a doubt. The technology has gotten to a point where that can be done.
Sure, the state counts on it.
And and necessarily there is this convergence now of human development and natural resource development, and it is creating new issues in many cases.
Do we need an ombudsman?
Well, no. I was going to. Yeah, I'm about done.
You better volunteer.
About done. But that's one of the points of this Groundwater Protection Council, is to bring together the Water Development Commission, State Engineer, Oil and Gas Commission, the DEQ, a couple of others, the federal agencies, when we get to that point, and to begin to look at where we're at and where the gaps might be and where the needs might be to deal with a lot of these emerging problems. So we don't have an answer.
Is it inviting
but
people
we're
like
kind
Deb onto that council?
Well, I think at some point that council will get to a place. We've had like 4 meetings, is all, and that council may in fact want to hear a lot from people like Deb. I would encourage them to do that, actually. but I'm not sure exactly when that will happen. But Deb has been a great spokesperson and articulate, and
well,
she would be one of the first people I'd ask.
The talk about sort of reorganizing at the state level does bring up the issue of the constant calls for the states taking over all regulation and the feds sort of getting out of it. The EPA, well, it already lost much of its jurisdiction back when Congress passed the exemption for fracking under the Safe Water Drinking Act. So that went out from under their purview. But I mean, what evidence is there that 50 state agencies, some of which are always facing budget cuts, as we all know, would do a better job than a single federal agency that has the tools that you mentioned earlier? They were so well equipped.
Well, you're asking me the question, and I have to say that the DEQ has nothing to do with the regulation of the oil and gas industry.
Mm-hmm. No, it's just environmental
defer
quality.
that to my colleague.
Right.
Well, and I think that's a very key point, Richard. We're in the middle right now of dealing with the proposed hydraulic fracturing regulations that the BLM has drafted, and we've commented on them, and they have put out this draft to regulate fracturing on all federal lands. And in theory, that sounds good. Well, what the state's position, what the governor's position, and what the Oil and Gas Commission is supporting is that we have put the regulations in place 2 years ago that are essentially the same. They're very duplicative of what the BLM is proposing. And we can react faster to technology changes, technology advancements, process evolutions. We've changed our rules, I believe, 19 times since 1996 at the Oil and Gas Commission to adapt to changing business models or operational issues, technology.
But when citizens wanted help, they went to the EPA.
Yeah,
Well, and not only that, but as we can put all the regulations that we want to on paper, and if we don't have people on the ground inspecting and watching how development is actually happening on the ground, then that paper isn't worth anything. And as those new regulations are written, we're still not addressing all the contamination that's out there. And so we're taking technologies like well stimulations like hydraulic fracturing that are brand new state-of-the-art technologies as they occur today and putting them in areas that are already severely contaminated, that don't have the infrastructure to support the hydraulic frac jobs, and so you get a bigger mess. And that's because there's nobody on the ground looking at it. There's nobody out there watching what's happening.
I think what we're seeing from the state agency standpoint, and also speaking, I think, from what I've heard from industry with the concept of the EPA, specifically with Pavillion, is they did address the problem. They took it on charge, but they haven't really satisfactorily gone about the methodology to solve the problem.
Well, the problem is never going to be solved until it's fully evaluated and sourced.
Well, and I agree with that completely, and I think that's what
2 monitor wells is not going to do it.
that's what the concern is that the EPA desire and motive to put out their results, even as in a draft form.
The EPA
You're
was
saying they should have done more, basically, instead of just relying on 2.
Well, I think what I feel, and I think speaking for the governor's office too, is that they were premature in issuing even a draft concluded. The report was out that it should have been peer-reviewed.
And unfortunately, they didn't want to come here and talk about it either.
No, and that's one of the concerns that I think the several state agencies that John alluded to that are involved in this process, State Engineer's Office, DEQ, Water Development Commission, Oil and Gas Commission, all looked at that and said, that's a start, but we need to do more work. Well, prior to doing that more work, we get a preliminary conclusion that causes a lot of discussion, a lot of disagreement, and a lot of concern that is it unnecessarily curtailing an economy and a business and an industry that is vital to not only the state but the nation.
Well, first of all, the EPA was very clear about why there were 2 monitor wells drilled and what they were looking for. And they weren't trying to evaluate that contamination or even determine the amount of contamination. They were simply trying to see if contamination occurred at those deeper zones.
Well, and that's the concern. Did they adequately address those questions? And what I know of them,
I think the USGS data shows that, yeah, that contamination is in those
That's the
beavers.
most recent study, of course, although they said there was no analysis.
Well, and
attached to it.
and I haven't analyzed the USGS data to make that determination to agree with it or disagree with it.
Well, clearly an ongoing issue, but I mean, Dustin, you've covered a lot of different issues over the years. How much of this issue of fracking do you think has been just because it's so spectacular when a well blows up or something like that happens? How much do you think is, it just catches attention because it's so unusual or so scary to people or readers or viewers?
Yeah, well, unfortunately for some folks, it's something to latch on to, and hydraulic fracturing is with us to stay. It's a technology. And the technology itself isn't wildly dangerous or bad. It's how it's managed. It's how it's done. It's where it's done, too. There are some places where maybe it shouldn't be used, and we need to do our homework first.
Because if you look at the public discourse that's been happening in Pennsylvania and in New York, there's a lot of, you could say...
there are local governments trying to put a moratorium and ban fracking, and that's not the answer. We should demand good management of these practices. The problem is that the nature of this development is it's pretty intense. If there's drilling around your community, that's a lot of activity, and it's a lot of activity on the surface, and it's a lot to manage, and things get spilled.
Things blow up.
Yeah.
And if you're one of the people who's unlucky enough to be in the areas where it spills and blow-ups and contaminates, there's not a lot of going back from there or cleaning it up.
And I will say, regarding EPA, I'm not convinced that EPA is standing in the way of the state when it says hydraulic fracturing rules. And what they really attempted to do is kind of is follow an industry standard.
You mean BLM? You said EPA, it's the BLM.
Or BLM,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Bureau of Land Management.
Yeah, is to already adopt what was recognized as best practices, and really kind of set the floor for best practices. I don't see that getting in the way of how Wyoming has oversight of hydraulic fracturing.
No, and I respect that. I see a disagreement. I have a disagreement with that concept, but I can see where the view of an oversight from the federal agency would perhaps solve some problems. But I think it would also create many in terms of two sets of essentially identical regulations. If there were differences in interpretations of those regulations, either within the state or outside the state, specifically within the state of Wyoming, you've got, I believe, 8 separate BLM offices. Yeah. So you've got an opportunity to have a lot of confusion, a lot of overlap of
But
what
when
needs to be
you
done.
look at national rules that are set out, I actually had the privilege of interviewing William Ruckelshaus, the first and fifth administrator of the EPA, recently, and we talked about those kind of rules. And he said that unfortunately, where the EPA is designed to step in is the sad fact that it's often a race to the bottom as states compete with each other to attract industries, and often in the process will be willing to relax environmental standards until you just end up with disastrous results. He didn't say Wyoming is doing that, but it is a well-known phenomenon, and hence the reason for national standards.
I have to add to this conversation. I think it's additive. And I always preface things by saying we have some problem areas in the state, and in those areas we always strive to find out what the root cause is. And I think we've done that pretty well everywhere, but we haven't gotten there yet in Pavillion, just to kind of get that aside. But on this regulatory front, I do want to point out that on the DEQ side, the EPA just recently enacted some air quality regulations, new source performance standards for the oil and gas industry. EPA modeled those after our rules. We were ahead of the game. We were first to regulate minor sources in the country. We saw and still see this continuing development and the need to have stronger, tighter management controls of it, and we have done that. I'm at a risk of speaking for my colleague, but I won't finish the sentence, but I do believe that the BLM modeled a lot of their fracking rules after Bob's, the rulemaking that your agency did a couple of years ago. So, the point there is...
Should have put a copyright on it. You got royalties.
Well, we still have problems, and we're not happy with that. But we're not sitting around doing nothing in terms of trying to deal with this, as Dustin said, this very intense energy development.
One of the issues that I think concerns us as the Oil and Gas Commission and the state is the state was very proactive in I think aggressively addressing the issues relating to hydraulic fracturing and clarified a lot of our rules and put in some new rules 2 years ago to address the issues. And now the BLM has come in and said we're going to have our own rules, which are the same as yours, with some changes. So what incentive is there for states to go after and set up their own rules and try to address their own issues within their state if the federal government is always in the shadows with the intention of coming in and trumping you? I mean, that's a concern that I think the governor has expressed publicly and is a concern of all the agencies that work hard to address these issues in a timely and effective manner.
Well, nobody knows better than John Cora that whose agency has primacy over many federal programs. Nobody knows better than John that those interior departments would rather see Wyoming DEQ retain primacy and retain management over things like underground injection, a lot of your air quality programs. And I just don't see how it's not going to work out the same way with BLM and the Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission on hydraulic fracturing.
Well, and just to clarify, the underground injection control program is administered by the Oil and Gas Commission.
Right.
And explain, if you would, what that program is.
The underground injection control program is an EPA mandate relating to injection of fluids underground, specifically.
That's under the Safe Water Drinking Act, is it not?
That's correct.
Okay.
So it's a federal, the Clean Water Drinking Act is a federal law, but the Wyoming Oil and Gas Commission, as several other state agencies, have been essentially delegated or given the approval by the EPA to administer those programs within the state.
So it sounds like we have a progressive set, like a fairly complete set of regulations and intent. Wouldn't it have been wise for the state to have some, as I said earlier, ombudsman type person who could step in and help the rare individuals or communities who are impacted?
Well, and how about putting inspectors from the communities on the ground?
That's sort of a ground up sort of approach, but.
I think an ombudsman approach is worth looking into. That, for me, though, the key is to make sure that after that ombudsman has done his ombudsman work, that there is a strong connection and a link to all the different agencies, and that position is formalized, so that you can follow up. I mean, clearly, one of the issues here is that things seem to move very slowly in getting to.
Well, right, to reestablish faith in the actual state agencies that are there on the part of the folks who wake up one morning and their water has gone bad.
The agency, the DEQ, has a outreach function, and we get calls a lot from ranchers and other people, and we do send people out all the time to talk with landowners. And then we seek out, in a lot of cases, if it's an industry-related issue, that person has the authority to go talk to the industry, anyone in the nearby area that might be causing the problem. So we are doing that. It's just not, it's not called ombudsman per se, and it doesn't reach out to the other agencies, of course.
And there's no teeth. There's nothing that really makes a difference on the ground.
You need enforcement, in other words, the teeth in the statute or what have you.
Real inspection and oversight on the ground where the practices are ongoing. And that's a budgetary concern, but we hear all the time about how much money how many revenues are coming from oil and gas industry, but we never hear about what it's going to cost to clean up the mess that's left. And when we talk about fracking, you know, I just want to go back to the fact that it takes a long, long time to even recognize contamination. I mean, a lot of the contamination that we're looking at and seeing that people are recognizing now is from years ago. And so we're adding insult to injury because those contaminations aren't always getting cleaned up and aren't even always recognized. And now we're adding a whole new area of potential contamination that we don't even understand.
Well, and there again, I think and I appreciate where you're coming from, but the implication that the fracturing at Pavillion has taken years to finally get identified, that's what we're trying to determine is, was it indeed fracturing that caused that problem? Was it natural elements? Was it something else? Was it the drilling operation?
And that makes the point. I mean, you are concerned about fracturing, whether hydraulic fracturing caused it or not. People who are living in it are only interested in having the contamination they live with mitigated and their lives move forward.
There was an inspector in the Pinedale area some years ago. I read this in some of the coverage of that, and he said, well, I don't have direct evidence, but it sure is a strange coincidence that all of this sort of happened all coincidentally. It's
Well, you know, it brings up a good. That's another area. You know, Deb is correct. The people are sitting there and they may be impacted, but where the agencies can take action is through enforcement. And in order to do enforcement, you have to have all these other circuits closed. You know, the source, the responsible party for the source, the pathway, and all of that. And that is the standard of proof that...
it's like a policeman making a case.
Exactly right. And so now, once we get to the enforcement stage, then we can start to clean up. But in the meantime, and Clark, Wyoming is a good example, in the meantime, those residents have to wait a while before...
Do you need more powers?
I don't know. Well, I have enough powers to conduct enforcement.
Well, there is no cleanup in Clark yet.
Well, we're working on it, though. There's the voluntary remediation program that they're in, and they're doing a lot of work.
They're doing a lot of work, but when you get to that kind of contamination, I mean, natural attenuation, which is the contamination volatilizing into the air, changing form, or maybe moving downstream, and so then it's somebody else's problem. That has occurred, but the deeper zones are not even attenuating. So it's so, and I'm not saying that you haven't done your job. I'm just saying it's so hard to clean that. Right, and meanwhile, those of us who are living there have been living with it for 6 years.
And that's and that's an issue that it's something that's outside of what we do.
Right. That's the problem that we're all trying to fix.
One of the issues that I think we're all also struggling with, and it was alluded to in your opening video with respect to the other landowners and operator or landowners in Pavillion, is that you do have you've got a hit and miss area out there, and that complicates the problem even more. If it were a wide scale, if the wells out there, if the oil field operations were impacting everybody, then it would make the answer a lot easier to come to. But when you have just a hit and miss problem,
but it was more a case of good wells going bad. It wasn't just drilling down and...
Well, most people don't know.
But I guess that's what I was alluding to, is a good well can go bad even if it's doesn't have gas wells around it. I mean,
because something has invaded it, and who knows what that is.
And we haven't even addressed the problem of what this does to communities. I mean, there you have neighbor against neighbor now, who are angry at each other. When for the people who are contaminated, the contamination is very real. They didn't want it. They didn't cause it. And yet, now their neighbors all hate them because the neighbors' property values.
You don't want to be a real estate agent in Pavillion.
Right. And why are they? Why do we have to have the conflict between the neighbors instead of against the people who are causing the contamination.
Well,
this repeats itself in
But
Wyoming.
people
The
may
same
not
thing
be causing the
happened.
contamination. That's what we're trying to resolve.
But that same thing plays out over and over again in Wyoming. It happened with coal bed methane in the Powder River Basin. Some neighbors got what they wanted because they had leverage to deal with the company one-on-one, whereas their neighbors they just got water drained on them that they didn't want.
Right.
And it turned neighbor against neighbor. Some neighbors had mineral rights, others didn't. It does split communities.
And what was that community?
That was the Powder River Basin
Powder
in
River.
northeast Wyoming.
Coal bed methane development.
And interestingly enough, we're now left with hundreds, maybe thousands of idle wells that are at risk of they're in the hands of companies that are going bankrupt, and so the state is working very hard.
And
to deal
also
with
could be the
those.
potential pathways for more contamination as the next boom hits for shale oil development. I mean, you're right, it goes on, and we never seem to catch up with it and address it.
Well, I know it probably requires a really big crystal ball, but what sense do you have of when we may find what we're looking for, the data that supports
Specifically with
real
with
conclusions?
Pavillion or
Yeah, well, beyond Pavillion, because as you look at any of those maps of the U.S., this is happening all over the nation. Pavillion is just an example that caught national attention, but
I see it as an issue that's never going to be satisfactorily and completely and unequivocally put to rest, answer one way or the other. As
just
long
because
as
the geology varies everywhere, is that?
the geology varies everywhere, the technology is constantly evolving. There's always going to be issues that something's going to happen.
So if
that-
it's not a geophysical solution, is it just a human solution where when something happens,
I
When we
think
don't
you
have
have
any more
to you have
air
to
and
apply
more
your
water and we're all dead?
your best available technology that you have at the time, apply that, and that's all I think we're humanly possible to do. Take what the facts are, deal with the facts as we see them. come up
Or
with the
slow
best
the
solution.
development down until you get a handle on the technology.
It really does require good leadership at the local level. At least we have these opportunities in Wyoming to try to get it right and to try to get everybody at the same table. We're pretty fortunate. We still have lessons that we haven't learned, but I think we have the opportunities here. It takes good local leadership to insist that before a major development gets underway, that we've got a really good understanding of the geology and our resources and what we're going
Right.
to do, and really good monitoring, oversight, and attach some liability to that too,
Right.
for when there is an accident.
so what you're saying is it's not just like state approval, for example, that would be required of new ventures, but you would want the communities to
Well,
have to give their consent?
Dustin's right that in all these areas where you have a lot of problems, siting is a huge issue from the get-go. Because when companies come in and decide to drill, they're only looking at their resource, and they're looking in terms of getting that out of the ground and making money. That's their job. But what we don't look at is the impact to the other resources, to the community, and so you're going to have conflict.
Well, how does the commission deal with that now in terms of the community level? When let's say a company comes in, they want to tap part of a field, and they want permission.
Interestingly, Wyoming does have the Industrial Siting Council, which was developed to do exactly what I just described for major industrial developments. Oil and gas, exempt. They're not under that authority. So
They are
that's part
major
of the problem.
industries.
And the nature of oil and gas development is more consolidated these days rather than spread out.
Well, I mean, back to my question though, Bob. I mean, what sort of input is sought? What role do local communities have now under Wyoming regulations to have some kind of voice, if they have a voice, in approvals?
Well, I would agree with both Dustin and Deb that I think there is some limitations at the local community level, but I think that's also addressed where an oil and gas lease is issued. that if you have oil and gas under a community, how is that lease issued? Was it issued with some stipulations by the lessor as to what can and can't be done with that lease? State law presently is set up with an oil and gas lease. If you have the lease, you've got the right to develop that lease.
So where does the community come into that approval process?
Well, again, it would depend on
I mean, is it formally set
when
up
those
with the
minerals
community?
were leased. If the community has any say in it, it would have been addressed in that lease. But I agree, it's oftentimes not.
Well, a lease is like a finished document. I mean, I'm just wondering at what stage of the process.
If some entity has mineral rights and leases out those mineral rights, then who obtains that lease has the right to develop it.
Regardless.
And I agree that if there's a community nearby that may be impacted, there are limitations.
So they
as to
have
what
no
they've got.
voice, essentially, in that decision process.
But at the time of the drilling permit, there should be some attention paid to geology, hydrology. I mean, and you can speak to this better than I can, certainly. I don't know how much authority there is for that, but that certainly would be something that would be valuable. Because if you were looking at in areas, for instance, like Clark, where the geology is so unstable, where there's a history of lots of seismic activity not connected to oil and gas development, you're right in a creek bottom, those things, then maybe if you could take action at that level, and that lease could be accessed from a different point.
Well, and again, I don't mean to use this as an excuse, but I hope it doesn't sound like one. I'm not as familiar with the Clark situation as you are. Mostly what I know about Clark is what I've read from the media. Because
Well, or even Pavillion, because
Pavillion,
same thing.
Pavillion, I think I'm a little much more knowledgeable on it. So, and I apologize for begging the details of Clark, but
I'll fill you in.
I can too.
specifically with Pavillion again. Development out there goes back to the 1950s, and exploration. You explore, you learn as you explore. You often don't have a complete picture of the geology and the hydrology and the producibility of the formation until you get in and drill. So you can't answer some of the questions that need to be answered. You don't know the extent of the field. You don't know if it extends under town.
But again,
and
it's
in fact, the University of Wyoming has just recently announced that they're undergoing a multi-year project to actually map the underwater, the groundwater and below groundwater resources of the state. It'll be some years in the future. They'll probably use some of that supercomputer time as well. But in a number of years, everybody would have a much more complete map to look at.
Well, and I would say too that with respect to what the Oil and Gas Commission has jurisdiction over and has in place in its rules and regulations, we do address development, exploration and development within distances of structures where you can't develop. I mean, if there's a town there.
And that's how far?
I believe it's 300 feet from an existing structure. But that would, if you had a town, then that excludes it.
Of course, with the horizontal, action going on in fracking,
That's correct. That
300 feet is nothing.
No, well, you can.
300 feet is nothing.
You can set it apart.
Next to your house.
There is that issue is addressed, and obviously it's not addressed satisfactorily among
And do we,
entities.
I'm sorry. And do we have a disaster fund, a cleanup fund? We have bonding requirements that hopefully cover the cost of plugging a well, but we don't have a really good plan for when things go wrong and there is a cleanup. Case in point is probably going to be Powder River Basin. Thankfully, we haven't had a huge
Well,
pollution.
describe that for a moment, if you would. What happened?
To drill a well, you have to post a bond, and you have to post a bond with the state. And if it's federal minerals, you have to post a bond with the state and the federal government. what tends to happen in the Powder River Basin, a lot of that was proved up by smaller companies that consolidated into fewer larger companies, and when the price of natural gas declined, it got parsed back out into smaller and smaller companies, and a lot of those are going bankrupt right now, or a handful are. And what the state is left with is has some bonds and cashing in some bonds to go out and plug those wells. But we need to ask ourselves at the beginning of a development: are we requiring enough in bonds? First of all, and second of all, what happens if there is a train wreck? If there is a big pollution? If there's a big plume of pollution?
The nuclear industry has that. All those who built plants had to put in a considerable amount of money for the eventual disposal of the spent fuel.
Yeah,
but
right.
I guess not so much in the oil and gas industry.
No, we don't.
Nothing. And we haven't even talked about impacts to public health.
Would you like to briefly address that?
But there's nothing in place. I mean, we can't, at this point, it's really hard to even determine what the health impacts are, because many of the chemicals that are used flush through your system. You can't do a blood test and say, well, you were impacted or came in contact with some of these constituents that were used. It's all, a lot of the chemicals aren't regulated, and so there aren't clear health impacts even recognized, let alone what people do when they start to get sick.
I understand that Halliburton has actually come up with a fracking fluid that you can drink. At a news conference, I read an account that one of their executives actually quaffed a glass of it. I don't know how widespread that will become, but... Well,
and it goes back, again, not just to fracking fluids, but to drilling fluids, and so many of the chemicals that are used through production. Fracking's it's the buzzword, and it is getting a lot of attention right now, but this is heavy industrial development that uses a lot of chemicals and a lot of very dangerous constituents.
It uses a lot of water.
And a lot of
water. Don't forget that.